Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
History doesn't have to be boring, buttoned up, or inaccessible. And it certainly didn't end in 1945. It belongs to all of us, and we share and add to it every day. Welcome to the History A Go-Go podcast, where I interview interesting guests, cover a motley crew of topics, and it's a place where you can sit, think, and drink all at the same time. I'm your host, Rob Mellon.
Here comes the king, here comes the big number one. Budweiser beer, the king is second to none. Just say Budweiser, you've said it all. Here comes the king of beer, so lift your glass, let's hear the
When
call.
you say Bud,
Budweiser beer's the one that's leading the rest.
when you say Bud,
And Beechwood aging makes it beer at its best.
when you say Bud, one taste will tell you so loud and clear. There's only one Budweiser beer. There's only one Budweiser beer.
My guest today is Bill Knoedelseder. He is a veteran journalist and writer who honed his investigative and narrative skills at the LA Times, where his groundbreaking reporting on the entertainment industry produced a string of juicy exposés and some critically acclaimed books. His first book, Stiffed, a true story of MCA, the music business, and the mafia, was nominated for the Best Nonfiction Book of the Year. His second book, I'm Dying Up Here, Heartbreak and High Times in Stand-Up Comedy's Golden Era, is about his time covering the colorful LA comedy club scene of the 1970s, when Jay Leno, David Letterman, Andy Kaufman, Richard Lewis, and Robin Williams were just starting out. And it became the basis for the Showtime drama series with Jim Carrey as the executive producer. His book Fins, Harley Earl, The Rise of General Motors, and the Glory Days of Detroit details the life of this visionary designer who revolutionized the way American cars were made. And finally, his book Bitter Brew, The Rise and Fall of Anheuser-Busch and America's Kings of Beer, was a New York Times bestseller. And that will be our topic of discussion today. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you. Good to be here.
I know you originally are from St. Louis, but your work experience took you out west and you're actually covering the entertainment industry and the news. Was there a specific situation, maybe an epiphany, that led you to research and write about the Busch family and the brewery?
You know, I grew up in St. Louis in the 50s and 60s. And when you do that, I mean, the Busch family story is part of your story. They were the Kennedys, the people who lived in St. Louis. I like to joke that they were like the Kennedys, but with guns. And you know, they were always in the paper. You couldn't drive anywhere without seeing some Budweiser thing or Anheuser-Busch plaque on a building. They were just part of everything. And I'd always kind of wanted to do that. And I remember when I first came out to LA and I was working for the paper and I wanted to write a book about the Bushes. Nobody was interested. I actually had people say, well, it was when Dallas was really popular. And they kept saying, well, oil in Texas is much more glamorous than beer in St. Louis. I didn't agree with that, but that was their call. So many years later, I mean, there was a book that came out called Under the Influence, which I read. And I went, damn, I wish I'd got a chance to write that. And then when I was in St. Louis back in this century, I was promoting my previous book, I'm Dying Up Here. And I was in St. Louis making some appearances. And someone introduced me to Adolphus Busch IV. And he wanted to hire me to write a book about his family. And I said, well, I'd love to write a book about your family. I've always wanted to do that. But I don't write books for hire. And he said, well, how would it work with you? And I said, well, it'd be like this. You would tell me everything, and then it would be mine.
That's a lot. That's a lot, Bill.
Right. You would tell me everything, and then it becomes mine, and you don't have any say-so other than if it's proprietary family stuff that you tell me, I will vet it as much as I can, and then I'll let you read those sections of the book to ascertain whether or not it's true as far as you know. But you don't get to read any other parts of the book. And he said, okay. And I'll help you. I mean, I'll try and make anybody I can get available to you, you know. And he was as good as his word. He helped a great deal. He got his mother to sit down with me. And he was extremely helpful and never interfered with anything. And he just wanted the story of his family told accurately with warts and all. That's what he was interested in.
Bill, it is tradition here to accompany the discussion with a special brew. Today, in honor of the royal family of American brewing, we have Michelob Ultra Pure Gold. Founded more than 160 years ago, Anheuser-Busch is one of America's most iconic companies and the undisputed leader of the U.S. beer industry. And Michelob Ultra is one of their most popular brands. Michelob Ultra Pure Gold Organic Light Lager is a superior light beer with only 2.5 carbs and 85 calories, and it fits nicely into the current diet that I'm on. This is also my opportunity to ask you to subscribe to the podcast. Simply hit the subscribe button on the directory that you use and get new shows immediately when they're released. Subscribing is the only way to get new shows right away. And to the amazing list of supporters and listeners from an astounding 60 countries now and hundreds of cities across America, I have to say thank you. And now, I raise my Michelob Ultra Pure Gold very high. And to the thousands of German immigrants that braved the oceans and came to the United States and started brewing beer, just like Adolphus Busch, I say cheers. Let's go back to the beginning. The origins of the Anheuser-Busch brewery predates the Civil War. What led a very young Adolphus Busch, the original Adolphus Busch, to come to America? What does he do after he arrives?
Well, he was, I think, the youngest or second youngest of something like 22 children.
Wow.
A man who was,
wow.
Yeah. So he was way down on the inheriting line. His father was well-to-do, and he was, I think he was a winemaker in Germany, and he wanted to make his fortune. He had some money, and so he came to the United States in 1857 or something like that, as I recall. He came in with a mass migration of German who came to America after the political revolution of 1848. And they were generally middle class. They were liberal, and the illiberals won the election. So they came into this country, unlike the Irish, who came starving and had to fight their way into the country block by block. The Germans came with money to invest. They didn't come into New York. They didn't try to settle there. They came in the interior of the country, and they came down the riverways, the Ohio River and Mississippi River, and they established breweries because all their countrymen were coming in with them. They weren't the only ones, and they saw a possibility of making beer for them. America was not a beer-drinking country. We drank whiskey. That's what they did. They started making beer for themselves and their countrymen, and it eventually took off from there.
And I mentioned to you, we're right in that same sort of historical path, being on the Mississippi River, just like St. Louis.
Right.
Just up the river a little bit there. And our history is very similar. And we had a large influx of German immigrants and population, and they did the same thing here. And they set up breweries. We only have about 45,000 people now in town, and there were 17 breweries here. So we're not even the size of St. Louis, but they were all very local.
I think it was called the German Triangle, is what they referred to, where they all settled in and built their breweries. Milwaukee's in it, Chicago, St. Louis, they're all big brewing towns. And they, if you're going to build a brewery, you got to be right near a river. You need a lot of water. So that's what happened.
You don't look like you're from around here.
Warum bist du aus Deutschland?
I want to brew a beer.
Welcome to America.
We don't want it here. Go back home. Abandon ship.
Welcome to St. Louis, son.
Beer for my friend, please.
Thank you. But next time, this is the beer we drink.
Eberhard Anheuser.
Adolphus Busch.
What allowed Anheuser-Busch then? Because we were talking about those Germans that are coming in mainly to the Midwest, really local breweries. So how does Adolphus Busch go beyond all of those local German breweries, not only in St. Louis, but in the region, and take the company to the next level?
First of all, he married his way in.
That helps.
Yeah, he married the daughter of a rich businessman who was not a brewer. He was a soap manufacturer. He'd gotten a hold of a brewery in default. The brewery had gone broke. So he took it over and was struggling to make 4,000 barrels a year. And it was terrible tasting stuff where people spit it back across the bar at the bartenders and stuff like that. So when Adolphus married his daughter, Adolphus was very sharp, and he started running it and became half owner, and eventually just took over the whole thing. And the father-in-law was very happy because he turned it into a going concern. And Adolphus was more of a industrialist, really, than a brewer. There's some stories he didn't like beer. He liked wine. I don't think he didn't like beer, but I don't know where that came from. But he had a vision. The problem with beer at the time was, for example, in St. Louis, there were 40 local breweries there. Okay, so talk about small independent companies. They sold in their neighborhood. They were named after the street that they were on or the neighborhood they were in and all that. And Adolphus was the first brewer in America he'd run about pasteurizing, and he pasteurized beer because he knew that if you pasteurized it, it would travel further without spoiling. You didn't have to consume it in the city that it was brewed in. One other thing that's good about St. Louis, ideal actually for a brewery, was that there were all these caves down off the river, right up the Mississippi, that kept things cool. So they could keep their beer in those caves after it was put in kegs and all that for, a pretty good amount of time. But then still, once you took it out of the caves, it was no longer cool. You had to consume it fast. So what Adolphus did was he expanded his market. He could ship it out of town. And when he started shipping it on the railroads, he started being vertically integrated before there was such a name for it. He started refrigeration units along the railroad path, with the railroad tracks, so he'd keep the beer cool. He first manufactured refrigerated cars and just kind of took over every part of the process, from the brewing to the ownership of the taverns, which he bought. And then he would make a deal with the owner. Okay, you're only going to sell Anheuser-Busch products, and in return, I'll give you all these free things. I'll pay for this. I'll pay for your rent, but you won't sell anybody else's beer. And that was legal back then. So that's how he became so much more successful than anyone else. He just pioneered a different way of marketing beer. And he was really, I guess, probably the primary brewer in the process of turning the United States into a beer drinking country. It hadn't been up to that point, and at some point, I think there is a date when all of a sudden beer was the most consumed beverage in the country, and we were outproducing Germany in terms of beer.
The interesting thing, Bill, is if you go right down on the river in Quincy, we got those caves too here.
Yeah, right.
I told you all the breweries that were here, and it's the same thing.
Right, exactly, yeah.
The limestone caves underneath the bluffs, so
yeah.
I know it very well. I know it well. The history of it, you explain Anheuser-Busch, and the name of the company makes total sense, but the flagship beer is actually called Budweiser. What's the history behind the Budweiser name?
The beer that they made, the Anheuser Brewing Company, was bad. He wasn't going to be successful with that. So he had to come up with a formula. And he and a friend of his took a trip to Germany in the Bohemian town of Budweis, Budweis. They found a lager that they thought was just great. And they bought the license to produce it in the United States, which wasn't any big deal to do at the time because nobody was, it wasn't an expensive thing to acquire. It was made by monks at a monastery. And so he named it Budweiser. And it had a nice German name to it. And it was a light, crisp lager that the Germans favored, as opposed to the British. They had a different kind of beer. They liked
the ales and porters and
Well, the ales and
stouts
and right. It was the difference was in whether it was top fermenting or bottom fermenting. There was a difference between the Germans and the Irish and the English in terms of the kind of beer they drank. The thing about a lager is that it takes longer to make because there's a longer aging process. In that sense, it was more expensive to make because it took longer to make it.
Anheuser-Busch has always been at the forefront of marketing and promotion. Does that go all the way back to Adolphus Busch? Does he try to gain an advantage in the area of marketing and promotion?
Yeah, he apparently had a gift for it or a sense of it. The remarkable story is there was a tavern in St. Louis, and it was going broke. And he was the main creditor to the tavern. So when it was going broke, he was in the tavern looking around to see what was there to take. And there was a painting behind the bar, huge painting, like a mural. It was called Custer's Last Fight. And it was an oil depiction of Custer's last stand. Not exactly accurate, but it showed Custer, fighting to the end, surrounded by, which is not how it happened. But I think he took the painting. He paid the guy $35,000 for the painting. He ended up being out $35,000, and he had the rights to reproduce it. Then he took that painting, had an artist make a smaller version of it and add in more gore, more scalping and things like that.
You need some sensationalism.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, this was only, I guess it was not that long after Custer's Last Stand happened.
I was going to ask. I was like, it couldn't have been long after it actually happened.
No, it was 15, 20 years maybe, something like that. I don't know. I don't remember the date. But it wasn't long. It wasn't like history. It was recent stuff. But he had a sense of America. He took that picture and he printed it and he had it put up in every place that sold Budweiser. It didn't say anything about selling beer. It didn't say anything about the beer. It was just the picture of Custer's Last Fight, this iconic picture, and all it said was Anheuser-Busch on it. And it was like a masterpiece of associative advertising. I don't know that it was ever done before, but he got that really meant something to the American people. And it became people would come in, they would just sit around and stare at the picture, and that ability to connect with people with Americana became part of the company's DNA. It never changed. And that came from him. I mean, he was such a huge figure inside the company, inside the family, is that, the question would be asked 100 times a day. What would father do? What would grandfather do? Whether they were talking about family matters or the business, what would you do? Everything about him was, it had to be just completely ordered. The legend had it that he was going to buy a brewery, but he decided not to because the area behind the plant was messy, so he didn't buy it. He was a huge figure. He had tremendous effect on the daily business, years and years and years after he was gone.
The temperance movement really targeted groups like the Irish immigrants and the Germans as well, but really it focused on hard liquor more than anything else. Did the German brewers attempt to distance themselves from those negative aspects of hard liquor and drinking that the temperance movement was targeting?
They did, and they were very successful at it in the beginning because they actually turned it around and started promoting their beer as, unlike that devil whiskey, this is a health drink. This is healthful. It's moral. It's a family. People, the German families drank together. So that's how they tried to turn that. But what happened was, because Adolphus Busch, one of his marketing gamuts was to own all the saloons that sold his beer, and other people who were trying to compete with him, all the other brewers compete, they did the same thing. And then people gradually came to realize that the people who owned all the saloons that were poisoning the men with whiskey were owned by brewers.
Yeah, it wasn't the Irish.
Right. It wasn't the Irish. No, it was these Germans. And that's when the backlash came. And he was vilified as he was the poster child for the temperance movement. He was the evil one, I guess. I mean, he would have rather just sold beer, probably, except for the profit.
The many Busch names and the size of the family, it's difficult to keep track. And your book, of course, does have a very helpful family tree. Who took over after Adolphus, and was he as successful as his father?
Yes and no. He was successful in a different way. He inherited, when his father died right before Prohibition, Okay. So what happened was right around the first part of the 20th century, you had World War I, World War broke out, and then you had Prohibition. And that just killed everything, of course. So he inherited a company that was basically, what it did was outlawed. And that lasted for 13 years. And he was tremendously successful in pivoting off that and keeping the company operating for those 13 years by building on what his father had done, the diversification, and building other things and making other products. They made ice cream. They made a non-alcoholic form of Budweiser, which they called Budweiser. And they insisted it tastes just like beer, even though it didn't. And I don't think the people believed it much either, because it wasn't a big seller. But they made freight cars. They made refrigeration units. They did anything they could to keep the company going. And while the vast majority, I don't know what the percentage is, 90% of the breweries in the country went out of business or shut down, Anheuser-Busch kept 2,000-3,000 people in St. Louis working. And he became beloved in the city because of that. And they suffered huge losses. His father left an estate of $60 million, which at the time was enormous. That's like, I don't know if there's anything compared to Bezos and things like that, but it was a huge, staggering fortune. And August, the son who took over, when he died, his fortune was a few million, which is very, very rich in those days, but nothing like his father. But he kept everything going and survived, and they were in good shape when Prohibition ended. They were ready to go, and and most of the competition was gone. So they shot out of the box pretty well when Prohibition was over. And then he died a year after Prohibition ended.
Budweiser has had a great ad. I think it's been maybe a decade or so ago now, but it showed like Adolphus coming across and showing up in St. Louis. And then I think it even showed the end of Prohibition in a big party, or all of these wagons rolling out. Is that actually what happened?
Oh yeah, it was a fantastic scene. And August, the number two guy, the number two head of the company, his son, not his oldest son, his second oldest son, ran the brewery, and he was the Alpha Busch, and he was promotionally oriented. He found for the opening night, it was going to be April 8th, 1933, I think is the date.
Sounds right.
When it was going to go back on sale, beer was going to go back on sale, and President Franklin Roosevelt had just been elected, and he made a promise to the brewers that he would end Prohibition. And he went further. He managed to give them a special arrangement so that beer could go back on sale before whiskey did, because they did something with the law where they all of a sudden made it legal to sell alcohol right away if it was under if it was 3.2% or under alcohol content. So on April 8th, beer went back on sale at midnight, and it would be 8 months before whiskey went back on sale, hard liquor of any kind. And so they had a huge thing at the brewery where 35,000 people gathered outside the brewery. And they did it in Chicago and in all the major beer towns, but the St. Louis one was particularly
festive. Pretty festive.
Yeah, right. Because Gussie had gone out and the company had approved him buying some Clydesdales, and then he found an old red beer wagon like they used to deliver the beer in, and he had it all redecorated, and he didn't tell his father this. This was all a surprise for his father. And he bought these Clydesdales, and at the time, before this, Clydesdales were, they were draft horses. They were mud splattered, draft animals, farm animals. They weren't perceived like they are now, this noble breed prancing along the ocean or in the snow. They were farm animals, very big ones. He had them all gussied up, I guess.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
And he and his brother Adolphus II, I think, surprised the father and took him into this large barn that they had there and unveiled this red beer wagon all done up with brass and these magnificent horses. And then that later that night, when the people were all standing outside, pressing around the gates, and they were counting down the seconds until beer went back on sale. The horses came out of the barn pulling this wagon, and it was just a sensation. They had ready the next morning. They had sent ahead a team of horses to Washington, and then they had one in New York City. So that in Washington, he bought 21 of these horses, something like that. Plopped down Pennsylvania Avenue up to the White House and delivered a case of beer to FDR. And in New York, they did the same thing. They came through the Lincoln Tunnel and down Fifth Avenue to where the former governor of New York, Al
Smith,
who was the foremost opponent of Prohibition. He accepted a case of beer live on the radio. That was how Anheuser-Busch came back. They made the biggest splash. All the brewers delivered a case to the White House. Only Anheuser-Busch had a team of 6 Clydesdales in a big red wagon right up to the entrance of the West Wing,
I call definite attention to the fact that just as soon as the Democratic platform pledge is enacted into a law modifying the Volstead Act, just as soon as that happens, a source of new revenue amounting to several hundred millions of dollars a year will be made available towards the balancing of the budget.
Gussy Busch, if you think about it, a lot of people don't know him, and they don't know him because he was in St. Louis. But this is the guy who introduced America to the Clydesdales. He did that. He bred them. He gave them all names. He raised them, and he made them this noble breed. And he's also the guy who married beer to baseball. That's an accomplishment.
He's quite a character.
Yeah.
And of course, it's outlined in your book. He could be a little difficult at times, but he could be very charismatic, as you spell out.
Yeah.
I mean, he's just a fascinating character.
Yeah. When I decided to do the book, I told Adolphus, I said, of course, I see your father is the most interesting character. And he said, yeah. I said, absolutely, the most charismatic of all the people in the family. There was nobody quite as exuberant. And whereas his grandfather was this great industrialist, Gussie's imprint on the company was his bright red passion. And that drove the company from there. Just passion. He had a passion for birds. He loved birds. So he started up these gardens at the breweries with all these exotic birds. And then that became a kind of a signature of the company. And then that turned into Busch Gardens. He was an amazing character. A lot of fun to be around. No fun to be on the other side of, across from him. He just gobbled up life in huge gulps.
You mentioned he married baseball and beer together.
Right.
How does and why does Gussy Busch buy the Cardinals in the 1950? I know he always claimed to have saved baseball in St. Louis.
That's a fair thing to say. I mean, he did. Gussie never cared about baseball prior to that. He liked gentlemanly sports. He was hunting and things like that. He played polo or whatnot, or he chased foxes. He wasn't a team sport guy. They came to him one day, some city leaders, and they said that the guy who owned the Cardinals was having legal problems. He was actually going to go to jail for tax evasion, and he was going to have to sell the company. They thought that it would be a good thing for Anheuser-Busch to buy it, and Gussie was like, "Well, why would I?" Then he thought about it, and they sort of explained to him that at the time, St. Louis was the farthest west and the farthest south baseball franchise in the country. Okay. So it was kind of America's team. There were more state people who tuned in to Cardinal games on the radio than any other. Okay. So the broadcast rights were worth a lot of money, and the reach was huge, and it reached a lot of people. And he thought about that. He said, let's see. Okay. So you've got, I would own a giant tavern sitting in the sun.
Sounds like you've been to Busch Stadium.
Right. Sitting in the sun in St. Louis heat. And all they would have to drink is Anheuser-Busch products. And he said, okay, yeah, that sounds like good to me. And not only that, what really sold it is that the people, there were other people in line to buy the ball club and were willing to pay a good price. But the guy who was selling, he wanted it to stay in St. Louis. And the other people who were trying to buy it were Milwaukee brewers. And Gussie thought, well, that's captain for Gussie, because he was going to beat out the Milwaukee brewing people, his main competitors, and they weren't going to get it. Pabst or Miller or whoever else was not, or Schlitz wasn't going to get this ball team. So he bought it, and he did save baseball in St. Louis. There's no question about it. And then he applied his bright red passion to that, and they had some rough years starting out. He also turned out to be kind of far-sighted in terms of the racial thing and segregation, because at his first team meeting, at the end of his first team meeting, he turned to the manager and said, well, where are our black players? He was looking at a room full of white players, and they said, well, we don't have any. And he said, well, that's not right. And I don't know if he was making a moral decision, but he clarified it by saying, we sell beer to all kinds of people. And it may have been, I don't know, it may have been sort of a business decision on his part, too. He says he intended to sell to black people. They came to the game. He ordered them to get black players. Go out and get some. That was like that. Another colorful Gussie story. And then they went out and got some player who lied about his age, and they bought him from some other team. And then Gussie insisted that he had been cheated because the guy was older than he said, and he wanted money back. Prorated by how old he was, or something like that. The real character. And then he learned baseball. He learned about baseball, and he saw that it connected with people, and he became, the big champion of the Cardinals. And all of a sudden, he was being interviewed. As a brewer, he was not a national celebrity, but as the owner of the Cardinals, sports writers all over the country would call him for quotes, and of course he gave them to him because he was, the things he said,
couldn't use them all probably.
Yogi Berra had nothing on Gussie. Although Gussie wasn't a malaprop guy, he was vulgar and profane and said what he wanted. The one story that's in the book that he was talking to a crowd of people, and he was talking about some employee who was retiring. He was saying all of these nice things about him, and like that. And then just sort of stopped for a second and says, which is not to say anything about his wife, who's the biggest bitch who ever happened. Just like that. That was Gussie.
Now, congratulations are in order for you, Colonel Busch, for the fine thing that you have done in buying the St. Louis Cardinals.
Well, thank you very much. We're delighted to be the owners of the Cardinals, and we're going to try to give the fans everywhere the finest baseball that is known in the United States.
So it's a very iconic family, and they have an iconic family compound. Could you explain the elaborate farm that was constructed and all of the things that were brought into the farm?
Well, the farm was built on property that had been owned by Ulysses S. Grant, which is why it was called Grant's Farm. And the person who built the compound there was August, the one who took over from Adolphus. And the property was given to him by his father, who bought it. And he also paid for the building of a $300,000, this is how rich they were. This is, very early on, $300,000 French Renaissance mansion. And he built what they called a barn hall that was designed to look like Rothenburg in Germany, a medieval German town. And a Barnhof was a fortress form, like in medieval times. People who had wealth when they were farming, they would literally build a wall around all their buildings and keep their animals inside. That's what he built, this giant Barnhof. There was a courtyard in the middle of it that they were, in later years, they could have 1,000 people sit down dinner in the courtyard, in the walled space where they kept their carriages and their horses and all their stuff. And it was a magnificent place. It was like St. Louis's version or Missouri's version of Hearst Castle.
Mm.
I'm sure it was the finest house in all of Missouri. I mean, I haven't seen them all, but the other brewers had nice houses too. But Grant's Farm was amazing. And they filled it with animals. I mean, there were herds of deer and elk and buffalo and anything you can think of. And, they had monkeys and there was a menagerie. And there was like 200-300 wild animals on the property. at any one time. And if you grew up in St. Louis, if you've been there, you've been to Grant's Farm.
Sure, yeah.
A trip to Grant's Farm was magic because you got to ride on a little train that would take you through the deer park. And these animals come right up to the train. They'd stop and they'd come up, and the buffalo would be standing right there. Or, the deer, they just look at you. It's like there was no other place that you could experience something like that. And that was all Gussie's idea.
The business transfer from Gussie to his son, August Busch III, does that happen when Gussy Busch is still alive?
Oh, yeah. Gussie ran the company for, I don't know how many years, but it was decades. His firstborn son, who was destined to run the company, because they operated on a primogeniture idea that it went to the oldest living son, inherited the company. And women, were nice, and they were pretty, and they were great to make love to and have babies and honor in all kinds of ways, but they were not involved with the brewery. That was men's work, men's business. So it was always going to be a male thing. And I think in the end that they would have done better if they let some women in. But he ran it like the emperor for years. He was the president of the ball club and the head of the company. And what Gussie said went. And his son, the firstborn, was given a thimbleful of beer before he had breast milk as a sign that he was the anointed one. But Gussie was not going to ever let it be easy for him to take over. And he rode him hard. Gussie fully intended to drop dead in the driver's seat. And August III was ready sooner than Gussie was ready for him to be there. And Gussie was getting old, and he had run the company. He'd built the company up beyond his father's and grandfather's wildest imagination, but he still ran it like it was a small family drugstore in a way that everything had to go through Gussie. And business practices had gotten to where he was falling behind. And the company was being challenged in areas that Gussie didn't see. It was in the early 70s when Miller Brewing started coming on. Philip Morris bought Miller Brewing, which was a sign that they were going to put a lot of money into Miller. And Gussie was still competing with Pabst Blue Ribbon, and he didn't see that as a threat. August III, who was a young executive trying to, fight his way up through his father to have an effect on the company and run it a different, more modern way, he saw that, and Gussie didn't. And he eventually convinced the board that Miller is going to kill us if we don't change, if we don't build new manufacturing plants, new breweries, because Gussie, he sort of stayed with his father's way of doing business, where you didn't want to borrow money to build a brewery. You wanted to operate out of profits. Well, that time had passed in American and business. You had to really invest. They needed a lot more breweries. They needed computers. They needed all this stuff that Gussie just didn't want to hear about. August III was hiring MBAs, and Gussie just hated that. And so eventually he got the board to agree, and they ousted Gussy Busch. The quintessential American beer baron was ousted from his own company. And they hid that for a long time. It was at a very dramatic meeting when he was confronted, and he thought the board would go along with him because they were all sort of his cronies or handpicked. But again, that had changed too. People could see that Gussie was getting a little, on in years, and he literally was deposed in a meeting. They actually had a cardiologist on hand.
Wow.
In case he stroked out when this happened. And he didn't, but he almost his face turned purple. He was so angry. He eventually settled down because he realized he was thinking about mounting an effort to buy it. Some other people buy it and fight back. And they were prepared. His own son was to take everything away from him, including the ball club. And what they ended up doing is they said, look, if you go away quietly and say that you're stepping down, you'll be the grand old man. It'll all be really great. And we'll let you be the chairman emeritus or whatever it is. And it'll still look like you're running things and you're in the background, and you'll still be the president of the ball club, and you can do that. That'll be your purview. And he took that deal, and his son, August Busch III, ascended to president of the company. And it could have been 15 years before it came out that he had actually been deposed and his son had done it.
I remember the Cardinals after Gussie had passed away and the product on the field started to seriously decline.
Yeah.
Gussie publicly was the Redbirds' #1 fan. August Busch III made no such public displays of affection for the team. Did he always plan to sell the team when Gussy Busch died?
He was more of a dollars and cents guy than Gussie. And the Cardinals had been very successful, and they were second only to the Yankees in terms of franchise. And Gussie, of course, he was so identified with the team that he had Cardinal outfits and big red Stetsons, and he'd ride around in the wagon waving to all the fans, and he became totally identified. But the Cardinals, they were profitable, but not much. So you could win a World Series and your profit would be a couple $1 million a year. Was it worth the effort, the time, and the investment and all that when you could, you could take that money and put it in a checking account and maybe make more? So August III always looked askance at the thing. And there was a lot of goodwill in the public and all that balanced some of that out. But he wasn't as enamored with having a baseball team as Gussie, which is not to say he didn't realize the advantage of sports and how sports sold beer. He realized that more than anybody. When he finally took over and turned his eye on knocking back Miller, which was coming on real strong, he launched Anheuser-Busch's marriage to sports in terms of marketing. And that was all him. Gussie saw it on a smaller scale, the St. Louis Cardinals selling beer and being a brewery, all that. August III saw it as something more than that. When he realized that Miller had gone out and bought up all these sponsorships of all these teams, he convened a big meeting at a hotel and had all these people come in, and they had like a war room where they just went down a line and they bought every sports sponsorship that could be available to any kind of sport. And if there was a three-legged burlap bag race somewhere, they were going to sponsor it. There was going to be a Budweiser sign at the finish line. And they bought up every sponsor they could, and they started outbidding Miller, and they started acquiring everything. And they became synonymous. Anheuser-Busch became synonymous with sports. But that was after Gussie was gone. And then, of course, it wasn't long after Gussie died that he sold the Cardinals. He didn't, August III didn't sell the Cardinals and maybe wouldn't have, because he knew that's his father. I mean, they had a famous falling out over him deposing the old man, but I think they sort of, buried some of that pain and hurt and all that before he died. He didn't sell the Cardinals team when his dad was alive, because I think that would have been the final blow.
Able to pick up good yardage on the play. The best part of this defense is their defensive line and their interior
Hello?
linebacker.
Hey, who? What's up? Nothing, B. Just watching the game, having a bud. What's up with you? Nothing. Watching the game, having a bud. True. What's up? Yo, who's that? Yo, pick up the phone. Hello? What's that? What's up?
Yo, where's Dookie?
Yo, Dookie! Yo.
What's that?
What's that?
Hold on. Hello?
So what's up, B? Watching the game, having a bud. True.
I'd like to talk about August Busch IV. In the press, anyway, seems to have lived a fairly tumultuous life, but I'd like to understand the position he was in. So if you go back to Adolphus, the very first one, and then his son is always constantly thinking about, what would father do, as you mentioned, and then you get to Junior and then the third. By the time you get to August Busch IV, it seems like it'd be very difficult for him to have that whole lineage of weight on top of you. Not that he's not an adult. Of course, he's a wealthy man, but it almost seems like he was put in a very difficult position from the very beginning.
Again, he was given beer before he had breast milk. His father made sure that helped him. So he was fated to run that company. That's what was expected of him. It was his job to lose every day of his life. And he had no choice in it. And that was the imperative, the family imperative, that he would be the guy He had a sister who was very smart because she was a girl. It was not going to happen. So, yeah, that did weigh on him. He led a very privileged life. He may not have been ideally suited to be, he wasn't Gussie. He didn't have that personality. He could be charming. He could be very nice. People liked him. He had a way with women, obviously, apparently. But, yeah, I imagine it was difficult. Again, it's hard to feel sorry for somebody who has that kind of wealth and everything sort of delivered to them.
Sure.
I actually said this, came up when I was talking to Gussie's third wife, I guess, third, fourth. Anyway, Gertrude Trudy, who was married to, had 7 children by. She was 83 years old, and Adolphus Busch was sitting there with us, and she was talking. And I said to her, it seems to me that the firstborn son in his family has always been sacrificed to the company. And she said, and she's not a Bush. She was from Germany. She said, well, absolutely. That's exactly what happened. And she turned to Adolphus and she said, I never wanted you to work for the company. And that is what happened. August the 4th had no choice in the matter. And he may have been talented at something else. He may have been a really great advertising guy. He may have been something else. In each case, each generation of father made it very hard on the son and developed a closer relationship with the second son, who was born of another wife. So they repeated the same mistakes over and again. I don't know if I'm being very clear on that, but it happened with August the 3rd, and Gussie rode him very, very hard. And then August the 3rd did the same thing with his son. He had a closer relationship with the oldest son by his second wife, to the extent that August the 4th never thought he had a real relationship with his father. It was always business. Business was first, and he never had a dad. He had a boss, and that's how August the 3rd felt about Gussie. It was the same thing 2 generations in a row. And then the whole thing of the primogeniture thing, where the firstborn son has to be the first, and that's historically dynasties eventually go down because of that, because the person who's best suited for the job doesn't necessarily get it.
Right.
It's all determined by birth order. And I think the record shows that August the 4th was not the guy to run the company. He might have been the president of his own advertising company or whatever, marketing. He could have been whatever. He was not without gifts and without charm or without intelligence. And he certainly worked hard. Part of the problem is that he played at least as hard.
Yeah. I think a few years ago he had a run-in with police because he landed his helicopter in like a parking lot in Belleville or something. I mean, you're right. He partied hard too.
And left it overnight, by the way. The next day there was nobody knows why is this helicopter in
it's just sitting in this parking lot in Belleville or wherever.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Colorful story.
So what eventually causes the situation where Anheuser-Busch was bought by InBev in 2008? How did it happen? I would say 50 years prior to that, you would think that was impossible. But of course, times had changed at that point. What actually happens for that sale to take place?
Well, it's sort of a replay of what happened when Gussie kind of aged out. August the 3rd had been very, very successful. He took the company, again, to heights that his father, that Gussie, never imagined. He made them, they were it. They were the world's beer company under him. That was it. And it didn't seem like anybody would ever challenge Anheuser-Busch. But it was becoming a global industry, and all the German and European brewers and the South American brewers and the Asian brewers were all starting to conglomerate. Okay, and they were putting together bigger and bigger consortiums to where all of a sudden, with one buy, Anheuser-Busch wasn't the biggest brewer in the world. If you're not the biggest, then you can't dictate things. They still had 50%, or a little bit better of the American beer market, which was the biggest in the world. But all of a sudden, they were being challenged. And his executives, August the 3rd, the guy who pushed his father out, he was hesitant to buy up foreign breweries and get into deals with them because he wanted to control everything. And if he took on a partner, then He was afraid that they couldn't control the quality and everything would slip. And then he would slip out of his hands and he wouldn't be able to drop down in his plane and go in and taste the beer and fire people if the beer in that plant didn't taste just right to him that day, which is what he did. So all of a sudden, he didn't make some deals. He passed up some deals. After all his best minds had gotten together and sussed it out and did all the numbers and got it ready to go, he would change his mind at the last minute. And one of those deals was a partnership that eventually led to the forming of InBev. Anheuser-Busch could have owned part of the company that ended up being InBev and thwarted that deal and never had an influence on it, but he backed out of it. He passed on it. And so it came back to bite it. And all of a sudden, somebody was big enough to literally make a money offer on Anheuser-Busch that they couldn't turn down. The Busch family did not control the stock of that company. They did not own it. They were a minor stockholder. They just ran it for years with a hand-picked board as if they owned it and as if they controlled it, but they didn't. People in St. Louis kind of assumed that they did because everything in St. Louis was Budweiser, blah, 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 Anheuser-Busch. Well, they didn't. So all of a sudden, these three fellows from Brazil who, were billionaires, they bought a couple of breweries and they formed this company named InBev and they made a bid and they offered such a premium on the stock as a corporate executive, you couldn't turn it down because you'd spend the rest of your life being sued by stockholders for not doing your duty. So, and I think August the 3rd saw that and he just held out for the best price. He also knew that his son was struggling in the job, had all kinds of substance abuse problems, which came out in the media, scandalous. And he figured the best thing he could do for the history, for the legacy of the company is sell it out at the absolute best price. And that would be the end of it. It would then be a foreign controlled conglomerate. It would still be Anheuser-Busch. It's called Anheuser-Busch InBev now because the people who bought it, the European and Brazilian, they bought European breweries too, saw an advantage in that name. It had a value, had a history, and all the stuff that Adolphus and August and Gussie and August there did, that will last as an image for a long time.
So the last question I have for you is the Busch family is so interesting, and of course your book details it. You think that it could be, I think it'd have to be an HBO or Showtime series. I don't think you could go anything less than that. But it's got it's got rich history.
Yeah.
It's got scandal.
Yeah.
It's got highs and lows and everything in between.
Yeah.
You think that it could be a great series? Do you think there's any history for that, or do you think there's any future for that?
Well, we're working on that. We're working on it.
Well, I wish you the best because I think it would be golden. And I think that person you spoke to years ago was completely wrong because it is interesting. I'll give you an example. What's one of the most popular shows now? Ozark. And that's in the Missouri Ozarks. And so
what is the most popular show?
One of the most popular shows.
It's called Succession.
Yes,
right?
And it's such a great atmosphere and scenery and everything. And of course, I think something like that would work. So I wish you the best in that.
Well, I'm hoping for it. That'd be nice.
Well, thanks, Bill. I really appreciate it.
All right.
I mean, this is such a great book.
Thank you.
And of course, if you want to find all the ins and outs, I, of course, tell the listeners to get the book and pick it up. It's fascinating. So thanks again.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate it.
I would like to thank my guest today, journalist and author Bill Knoedelseder. And if you would like to get the New York Times bestseller, Bitter Brew, The Rise and Fall of Anheuser-Busch and America's Kings of Beer, just click on the link in the description below. Of Bitter Brew, John Sayles, the director of 8 Men Out, said, Bitter Brew deftly chronicles the contentious succession of kings to a uniquely American dynasty. You'll never crack open a six again without thinking of this book. The featured brew was Michelob Ultra Pure Gold from the world-famous Anheuser-Busch Brewery, which of course is headquartered in St. Louis, Missouri. Once again, remember to subscribe to the podcast. If new shows aren't showing up right away, just click the subscribe button. And next time, they will show up No more waiting 24 hours to get new episodes. If you want more information on the guest and books, like the History A Go-Go Facebook page. The music was provided by the band Bones Fork, and a link to their website is in the description below also. And again, to all the listeners and supporters, I have to say thank you. There are many more great episodes on the way, including episodes on presidential spirits, Grierson's daring Civil War cavalry raid into Mississippi, the nation's leading Ulysses S. Grant impersonator, the epic history of America's most notorious pirates, and the warrior Shawnee Chief Tecumseh. So join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History A Go-Go.
Here comes the king, here comes the big number one. Budweiser beer, the king is second to none. Just say Budweiser, you've said it all. Here comes the king of beer, so lift your glass, let's hear the call. Budweiser beer's the one that's leading the rest.
When you say Bud,
And Beechwood aging makes it beer at its best.
when you say Bud, one taste will tell you so loud and clear. There's only one Budweiser beer. There's only one Budweiser beer. When you say Bud, there's nothing left you can say. When you say Bud, the king is right on his way. When you say Bud, the king is coming. Let's hear the call. When you say Bud, you've said it all. When you say Bud, you've said it all. Here comes the king, here comes the big number one. Budweiser beer, the king is second to none. Just say Budweiser, you've said it all. Here comes the king of beer, so lift your glass, let's hear the call. Budweiser beer's the one that's leading the rest. When you say Bud, and Beechwood aging makes it beer at its best. When you say Bud, one taste will tell you so loud and clear. There's only one Budweiser beer. There's only one Budweiser beer. When you say Bud,